Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. It's time at last. At last, we're going to take a trip to Otherworld. Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. My name is Paul Mount. It's great to be back. Apologies for the lack of videos in the last few days. I don't think I've posted anything significant or substantial since Thursday. I did my out of theatre short of Superman. But that's the way this channel is. I try to get 3 full videos up during the week, and I think I did one Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and circumstances have stopped me recording anything of any length since Thursday. So I'm back to do a much requested video. Well, I say much requested. Several people have asked me to review quite an obscure American sci-fi series. More of that in a moment. I'm Paul Mount. This is my world of stuff. If you're new here, and I know there are some new people who have come on board in the last few days, even though I haven't put up any new material, some people have found the channel, which is fantastic. So if you're new, please stick around. There's loads of stuff here, classic sci-fi, classic films, classic TV. Bit of comedy coming up this week, hopefully my first retro TV comedy classic review. That's a bit of a mouthful. So stick around, there's all sorts of stuff here, so it's great to have new people on board. Right, I hope you're all well. It's been a hot and steamy few days. However, today, Tuesday, it's not. It's grey, it's drab, it's overcast, the temperature's plunged, and it's pouring down with rain. So what better time to sit and actually catch up with doing a couple of videos? Can't put it off any longer. Not that I particularly want to. The series I'm talking about today has been requested several times by a couple of my trusty, loyal, much beloved subscribers, Paul Chaiza, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly there, Paul, and John Baldridge, who have been mentioning to me for some time about a 1980s science fiction series that I don't think I had ever heard of before. Or if I had, I'd forgotten about it, because I think it's fair to say it didn't exactly fall through the cracks of television. It sort of fell through the cracks and then cemented them over again. So it would never be found. So I'm grateful to both of you guys for recommending this series for me. And I apologise for taking so long in getting around to actually sitting down and watching it. And I did watch it. I watched all 8 episodes, because there only are 8 episodes, of the series called Otherworld, a 1985 science fiction series that was created by Roderick Taylor. Roderick Taylor is a name that might not mean very much to you. He's actually sort of a rock musician in America. I think he has a history of being involved in rock music and making albums and so on. And he dabbled in TV production here and there. He had a couple of minor successes. Otherworld was a series which he created in 1985. And watching it, I'm very much reminded of that genre of science fiction storytelling that was very popular back in the 1970s. And I think I've referred to some of these shows in previous videos. Things like The Fantastic Journey and the TV spin-offs of Planet of the Apes and Logan's Run. And I'm sure there are many other series that follow the same sort of template. And even to an extent, things like Lost in Space and Land of the Giants, which were about dispossessed people taken out of their normal world and thrown into another world and trying to find a way either to survive or to get back home. It was an idea that was very popular in the 1970s, and a lot of American science fiction series followed this template. None of them were particularly successful. Most of them were cancelled after a handful of episodes. I think probably one of the most successful was Planet of the Apes, which ran for 16 episodes. So it is, I suppose, curious that this concept was resurrected back in the 1980s. But I can see why it was resurrected. Now, this is a series, as I said, which hasn't been seen on TV since the 1980s. It was screened on the CBS network in 1985, just once, 8 episodes. And I think it then surfaced again on the Sci-Fi channel. The only way you can see this series, if you're minded to watch it, is to go onto YouTube. They're not great quality. They're not DVD quality, they're not VHS quality. They're very poor VHS rips that have been uploaded to YouTube. And I think we must be grateful to whoever did that, because that gives us a chance to see this series, which we wouldn't otherwise do, because this isn't going to get a physical media release. This isn't going to be picked up by a streaming service, because let's just say it wasn't a very successful series at the time. And I also want to apologise at this point, because obviously I do like to punctuate my videos with images and photographs and so on for the series. Google Images isn't full of very many publicity photographs of this series, so I've had to locate some screen grabs, which, because they're taken from these poor quality YouTube uploads, aren't very good. So I probably won't put in too many pictures, just ones that punctuate and illustrate certain characters and incidents and so on. Anyway, enough of this waffle. Otherworld. What did I think of Otherworld before I talk about it in any more depth? Well, actually, I quite enjoyed it, and I didn't think I would, because I knew it was very much in that people on the run genre, which was a bit boring back in the 1970s. I thought, this isn't going to be very appealing, this isn't going to be very satisfying. But watching the 8 episodes, and I didn't watch them in a rush, one of the reasons it's taken me a while to do this video is because of the quality of the image. It's not the sort of thing you can binge watch on YouTube. I've watched them over about 3 or 4 weeks. But what I took from the series was that it actually did some interesting things with a slightly florid and overused format. And I think when you step back and look at the 8 episodes, you could see that it was actually quite clever in that it was sort of parodying American culture at the time and society and certain things from popular culture, some of which still have resonance today in the 21st century. And whilst the episodes are a sort of a mix of satire and social commentary, they're also sci-fi and fantasy, and they show their roots quite clearly in several episodes which you can trace back to other science fiction TV shows and films. But some of them do have harder science fiction ideas behind them, not incredibly well presented all the time, because they're bedeviled by issues around budget and so on, because I imagine it was a fairly lowish budget series on CBS. And this is a show which came along at a time when science fiction was a no-go area, despite the success of Star Wars and so on just a few years previously, and the resurrected Star Trek film series. TV networks, particularly in America, were sci-fi averse. They didn't think that science fiction would appeal to a particularly large audience. And I think it's interesting to think now how things have changed. Science fiction is still a bit of a ghetto on TV, but commissioners and streamers and channels now know that there is an audience there, a very passionate audience that will watch these type of shows. The series then is about the Stirling family. Father Hal, his wife June, his teenage son Trace, their young teenage daughter Gina, and their young son Smith. They're on holiday in Egypt and they take a tour of the interior of the Great Pyramid of Giza. This tour takes place during a conjunction of the planets, which takes place once in 10,000 years, we're told. They are, during their visit, mysteriously and quite inexplicably transported to another world. It's a planet which may reside in a parallel universe. The planet that they arrive on is called Thel, and it's a mix of sort of humans and androids and robots, and it's a mix of high technology and low technology. The planet is divided into various provinces, and all these provinces, a bit like different countries on Earth, have different governments and different ways of life, different habits, different cultures. And our hero family, the Stirlings, move from province to province during the run of the series, ostensibly trying to find their way back home by virtue of these mysterious obelisks, which they're hoping will somehow enable them to find their way back to Earth. So the series takes up this narrative idea of them moving from place to place in every episode. And I suppose I talk about this format as being redolent of those 1970s science fiction series. But if you think of shows like Star Trek in the 1960s and even our own Doctor Who, they had vaguely the same sort of idea of different stories that moved different locations. So this is a different version of that, I suppose. So as much as I criticise series like this for having this slightly narrow storyline, it's only a version of things that we've had in better regarded science fiction series like Star Trek and like Doctor Who. There are some interesting rules governing the travel of the Stirling family across these different provinces. Travel itself is strictly regulated by zone troopers, sort of a military elite. And the people of one province, it turns out, know nothing of people in the other provinces. So everywhere these characters go, there's no reference back to where they've been before, because it means nothing to the people in the new province that they travel to. And there's lots of backstory that's sort of dropped in here and there, which explains about this world and how it's become disjointed and separate. The central government rules in a province called Emar, which is ruled by a praetor, and the various provinces are often referred to as territories, and there are various creators and rulers of each of these individual territories. And there's reference occasionally to the Wars of Unification and a Church of Artificial Intelligence. That's something which the series actually touches on quite a bit, the idea of artificial intelligence. And I think in that regard, the series is a bit ahead of its time, because back in the 80s, I don't think people were talking about AI and that idea of an artificial consciousness in the way that we talk about it routinely today. In the first episode of the series, Rules of Attraction, it sort of sets up the scenario where the Stirlings are transported to this mysterious world. they almost immediately have a scuffle with a high-ranking zone trooper whose name is Commander Kroll. He, incidentally, is played by Jonathan Banks, virtually unrecognisable from the actor who plays Mike Ehrmantraut in Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. I think you can sort of see it's him, but of course he's so much younger in this. And he brings a sort of authoritarian grit to a character who could have just been a slightly boring thug. Because what happens during that first episode, the Stirling family clash with him. They have access to a crystal, which gives them the ability to move between provinces. Kroll then is obliged to follow them across the planet to the different provinces in an attempt to try and get the crystal back. And he is, in many regards, the recurring villain or baddie throughout the series, because he is following them. When they discover that he's there, they have no choice but to up sticks and move to another province. The core idea of the series is that basically in every episode, the Stirling family arrive in a new zone. They have to deal with and come to terms with and understand the particular mores and habits of that zone. And then very often Kroll will arrive, spot them, shout, "There they are!" and they have to move on to another zone. In some regards as well, I suppose it's a bit like Sliders, which I reviewed fairly recently. Again, I think that there's something about this idea of travelling to different places, which is a fundamental in science fiction. I suppose the whole idea of space travel itself is very much based on that idea of being able to go to different places. So I think this plays very much on as well, of people who land in somewhere which appears to be a bit like Earth, but actually isn't, because the social structure is slightly different and there are certain things which are completely the opposite of what our characters are familiar with on Earth. I actually quite enjoyed watching Otherworld. It has a certain style about it. You have to set aside, if you're watching it now, the fact that it's from the 1980s, so there's lots of mullet hair in evidence. There's a very synthy theme music. It has that very powerfully 80s, mid-80s synth feel to the music. And it has a look about it which is very, very 1980s in terms of the visual effects. It's not an effects-heavy series, but the effects it does have are fairly decent. There's a few sort of laser battles here and there, and there's a couple of nice matte shots. But it isn't about special effects so much. It's about these characters and where they go and how they deal with what they find. And that's what it's all about. It's a very good cast. It's led by Sam Groom, who plays Hal Stirling. His wife June is played by Gretchen Corbett. Tony O'Dell plays the hunky Trace. Jonna Lee, mullet and all, she plays the daughter Gina Stirling. And the son, Smith Stirling. Smith? Okay. He's played in the pilot episode by Brandon Crane. The pilot episode is actually split across two episodes, the first episode and the fifth episode. And in the intervening episodes, we get Chris Herbert playing the character of Smith, who isn't really integral to the plot most of the time. He sort of trails around behind his parents or being annoying to his brother and sister. But I did find the stories were actually quite engaging, and it was quite fun to spot where the storyline and the ideas for the stories had come from. Now, the show's creator, Roderick Taylor, he had pitched this idea to CBS, and as I've said at the time, for bizarre reasons, considering the success of the genre on the big screen, they were very worried about science fiction. They didn't really want to do something science fiction, but they wanted to sort of dip their toes in the waters, but they didn't want a space show. They didn't want anything with spaceships and aliens and so on. So I think when he created this series, it appeared more grounded and a bit more relatable to an audience, particularly with the storylines that touched on issues that were of concern and popular at the time. But he had enormous difficulty in getting his storylines across to CBS. At least 10 of the storylines he'd pitched for the show were rejected outright as a bit too much for the audience to take to. And CBS didn't really support the series very well. I think it ended up in a graveyard Sunday night slot, and it didn't pick up much of an audience, and it was summarily cancelled after 8 episodes, which is a shame. But then I think it's not a show that would have had massive longevity to it, because there's a built-in obsolescence in the scenario, and I think it would have had to come to some sort of resolution. But I think for a series made in the 1980s, it makes some quite bold choices in terms of some of the stories it tells. I have to say it was actually the third episode, Paradise Lost, which sort of drew me into the series. I quite enjoyed the first 2 episodes in a tongue-in-cheek sort of way, but I thought Paradise Lost was actually quite a strong episode, because there's a lot of ideas and a lot of stuff going on They find themselves in a province which, like most of the provinces, has a secret, but it appears to be an idyllic place. It's an island community which has strange things going on in the background, some strange experiments going on. But Hal Stirling finds himself entranced by a mysterious, sophisticated looking woman on the island, and he gets drawn into a strange web of seduction where he appears to be willing to sacrifice everything, his family, his wife, his relationship, his everything, to be with this woman who's exerting this strange power over him. And I thought that itself was quite a strong thing to do in American science fiction series, because you'd had this man who's depicted as this strong father figure who's leading this family as they try to find their way back to their own world. And yet he's willing to give up his family, and he falls in love with somebody else. And he has an affair with somebody else. It's made quite clear that he spent the night with this woman at one point. And that's quite odd, and it's quite bold and quite adult. And I think this was an adult series. It was never intended to be a children's series, because it does deal with quite sophisticated themes in quite a clumsy way some of the time. For example, in the next episode, Rock and Roll Suicide, again, I think you look at that episode title and think, okay, I know what this is all about. And sure enough, it's about that. They arrive in a province where rock music doesn't exist. It's never been invented. And Trace and Gina become pop sensations. They effectively create rock music in this province, and they sing popular songs from the 60s, 70s and 80s as if they created them. And I think this is sort of a comedy episode because it parodies the music industry and the way that people become sensations overnight, and the power of teeny pop music and that sort of thing, and the power of music basically. But it is done in quite a comedic way. And there are several episodes which have some quite comedic stylings to them. I think this is one particular, because every episode is sort of narrated by Sam Groom as Hal, and he's explaining their predicament and where they pitched up. And I think I almost fell off my chair in episode 4, where he says they've arrived and he's apparently got a job making blades for windmills in a factory, and he's also got a part-time job as a clown. It's his first taste of showbiz. And I thought, okay, this is going to be a comedic episode, and it is. It's quite funny, it's quite witty, and it makes its points about music quite well. But it's a very odd shift in tone from a series which had been sort of quite dark for the previous couple of episodes. And then there's an episode called Village of the Motor Pigs, which is a sort of a vaguely Mad Maxy sort of story about these hippie-like outsiders who live off-grid, and they sort of try to split up the family and cause a division between the family. And there's an episode called I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar. I mean, you don't really have to watch that episode to know what it's about, but I did watch it anyway. And yeah, it's about a society where women are the ruling class and men are just relegated to slaves and servants and so on. We've been through all that sort of thing quite a lot in science fiction, and it's quite heavy-handed and quite clunky, but it has a certain entertainment value to it because it's quite amusing to watch these sequences, which are quite well done, of subservient men, and how not exactly the tables aren't exactly turned, but how the society is changed by the arrival of the family. Mansion of the Beast. This is very much Beauty and the Beast. I thought that this had been inspired by that series Beauty and the Beast that came out in the 80s that starred Ron Perlman and Linda Hamilton, but this actually predates that by a year or so. But the makeup of the beast type creature is very similar to Vincent in Beauty and the Beast. They arrive in a land which is ruled by this mutated human type character called Virago, who takes a fancy to June, Hal's wife, and wants her to be his companion. And it is the Beauty and the Beast thing. She sees that he's a monster, but during the episode she realizes that he is in fact quite human beneath this monstrous exterior. It's quite nicely done, but it is, like many of these episodes, quite sort of obvious in the story that it's borrowing from and the way it's telling its story. The final episode is called Princess Metra, and this is one of those episodes where a character is mistaken for somebody else. Here Gina is mistaken for Princess Metra, the long-lost 200-year-old princess who once ruled the province. And during the episode, she is able to influence the way that the culture deals with rebels and dissenters, and ends with the characters moving on to their next adventure, which was never to be because the series ended after its 8th episode. So that's Otherworld, which I have to say I did enjoy watching. It isn't a show that I will revisit, I'll be quite honest about that, but I'm glad I've had the chance to see it. So I'm hugely grateful to Paul and John for recommending it and pushing me into watching it, because it was interesting to see a show which took a familiar idea but actually treated it with a bit more intelligence and a bit more thought. And I think that there are in this series the germs of something that could have had a bit more longevity. I don't think it's a show that could have run for 5 or 6 years, because I think by the very nature of its format, it was going to run out of steam. And it is unfortunate that because CBS's scheduling decisions, it didn't even have a chance to find an audience, and people weren't allowed to find it, because it deserved to do a bit better. So I am quite pleased to have seen this sort of sci-fi outlier that has been forgotten. And as I said, I don't think I'd ever heard of it before. But overall, the performances by the cast are pretty good. They're quite earnest. The dialogue is a bit clunky in places, and I do find it quite weird that they travel from province to province. But there isn't any huge sense of urgency. They arrive in a new province, and they're there, and they're suddenly living in this really nice house, and they get jobs, and they fit in. There's no sense of them being fugitives or on the run until Kroll appears and sort of waves his fist at them and says, "I'll get you." But they seem to pitch up and settle into these places quite happily, and the imperative to get back home sort of drifts into the background quite a lot. So it's uneven in its tone and in the way it progresses its ongoing storyline, if it progresses it at all. The series is enlivened by some interesting guest appearances here and there. In the Beauty and the Beast episode, John Astin actually appears in a supporting role. He is probably best known as the original Gomez Addams in the Addams Family. He appeared briefly as the Riddler in a couple of episodes of the classic Batman series, and he's obviously very well known as the father of Sean Astin from the Lord of the Rings films. I was quite pleased to see an appearance by Survivor star Carolyn Seymour, not looking a day older than she had 10 years earlier when she was one of the survivors of the post-apocalyptic plague on BBC TV. She appears as this rather forbidding and imposing council member on the province in the province of the final episode. It was interesting to see her in the cast, and I noted that the episode was directed by Peter Medak, who directed films like Let Him Have It and The Craze. He was married to Carolyn Seymour for a while. Although they got divorced the year before, they clearly kept on good terms because he cast her in this. We also had one episode that was directed by Paul Michael Glaser from Starsky and Hutch. So in some ways, it's quite an accomplished series, and there was some interesting talent behind the camera, and it attracted some quality guest actors. There's clearly an effort here to make a science fiction show with some punch and some oomph behind it, but it's just a shame that it wasn't supported properly and it fizzled out so soon into its run. But I am very pleased that I've actually watched this series, and it's one of the great things about this channel now as it's developing, that people are recommending things to me to look at that I might not have seen or might not have considered, and I eventually get around to seeing them. So Otherworld, if you want to see it, as I said, the only place you're going to see it is on YouTube. The quality isn't great, but it's worth persevering with because it's an interesting show that I think deserves to be remembered better than it is. But I think because there are only 8 episodes, it isn't one that's going to be attractive for anybody to put out on any format. So your only way of seeing it is going to be on YouTube. I'm going to give Otherworld, I'm going to give it 7 out of 10. There were loads of faults and loads of silly things about it, but I found it quite charming in a strange way. And I would recommend, if you're interested in the strange dark corners of science fiction TV, it is worth a look. Right, thank you for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Welcome back. I am back, and there's lots more stuff to come. If you're thinking, God, that's a lovely t-shirt that man is wearing, it's my Keep Taking the Stuff t-shirt, which is available to you from a link down below at a very reasonable price. It looks fantastic, and you look the bee's knees in it, so why not pick up a t-shirt? Right, that's it for now. I will see you soon. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.